Okay, good to see everybody. Hope that everyone's doing well and your families are well. And just glad that we can be here together during this time. And sorry, I think the speaker was covered. Um, Hello, Carissa. And today we're going to start out just speaking a little bit about continuing some of the conversation around research ethics, informed consent, and then moving into discussing together in small groups our revised research questions and your draft questions for interview. And so for today, I'd asked you to read, there's two short statements, one from the American Anthropological Association, their Principles of Professional Responsibility, and then another from the American Folklore Society statement on ethics. And many professional societies all over the world have similar, not two different statements such as these. I fairly randomly picked these two, but you can certainly find many others. And just to preface that, what's really important here is that this statements like these are talking about ethics from a certain disciplinary standpoint. And so in the example for, the Folklore Society, this is talking about, what the expectations of folklorists' responsibility is. Saying that, what's of most importance is that understanding and respecting and being held accountable to the ethics and expectations from the communities within which you're working. And so this can look different in different places, right? Sometimes it requires going through official leadership for permissions. It requires certain agreements from the community. Or if a community doesn't have, say, kind of formal agreements in place, that are you developing that together? And that's where we'll get into in a little bit for part of what I'm asking you to submit with your proposal at the end of the term is also kind of a draft of what it might look like to do a guidelines of responsibility, a guidelines of ethics, where that's going beyond informed consent to really explicitly talk about what is your responsibility, how will you be held accountable, and then working in partnership with the community, what's their responsibility. So often when you're putting something like that together, you're doing it in collaboration with the community. So the way we'll be doing in this course is kind of, for practice where you're not necessarily working with the community per se, but, in actual practice that you would be putting that together in collaboration with the community partners. And where, just to go over the ethics covered in the American Anthro Association, in their principles, they talk about one, do no harm. And this is an important point to continuously check back on, right, at each stage of the project. For all of these responsibilities, it's not just thinking about it at the beginning, it's coming back to them through each stage, each phase of the project, and making sure that, for example, doing no harm, or do you need to make adjustments along the way? 2, being open and honest regarding your work. 3, obtaining informed consent and necessary permissions. And again, this works differently in different contexts and communities. And so it's critical to understand going in, finding out what are the permissions needed. Who do you need to be speaking with? Some of that can take quite a long time. Are you building in time to be doing that? For example, here in the US, if I was working with a number of tribal communities, with tribal nations, the process in going through their institutional review and going through their government, right, that can take a long time, right? So that you have to be prepared and build that time into your research work. 4, of weigh competing ethical obligations, do collaborators and affected parties. 5, making your results accessible. And this becomes really important too when we think about ideas around um, data sovereignty and who has access to the data. Um, so often communities are involved in research and they never see the results and they never have access to the data. That's often theirs, right? They're the ones providing that information. And so what's being done to make both the results accessible and also the data itself accessible to the community? And that's part of the agreement up front of who owns that data. Is it really yours as the researcher, or does the community own that data? And you're working in partnership with them. And so this also relates to the sixth principle in this American Anthro professional responsibility statement, that's protect and preserve your records, right? So that means, how is that data being safeguarded? Where is it being stored? How is it being protected on your end? But then also, again, what's the agreement with the community so that they have ownership of it, if they have access to it, that those agreements are worked out up front at the beginning of your work together. And then finally, maintaining respectful and ethical professional relationships. And in a bit of a similar vein, the statement I had up there from the American Folklore Society really focused on responsibilities in different layers. There's the layer of primary responsibility, is to those who you are doing the work with. Are they the ones being studied? Are they working in partnership with you? That your primary responsibility is to your community partners. Following that, there's responsibility to the public, responsibility to the discipline within which you're coming from. If you're in the education field, there's a responsibility to students and a responsibility to sponsors. And this becomes really critical as well, because if your research is being funded by a certain institution, by a certain agency, is that influencing the work and the outcomes? How much kind of independence do you have? And this is a very common thing where, for example, I tell my students here, there's a number of professors who get, so where I am, I do some teaching at University of California, Santa Barbara, and quite a few professors, they get their research funds from the oil companies. And so if they're giving a lecture in class saying about why there aren't negative effects from the big oil spill we had a couple of years ago off the coast here, you have to question how they're getting their results and who are they being responsible to in that moment. They're being responsible to their funders, right? So it's really important to think about where that funding is coming from for the work. And are you able to stay true to the work that you want to be doing? And so saying all of that, I'll just pause if there's any questions or reflections that you would like to share. Okay, so we're going to take a look before we get into the breakout groups. I'd like us to take a look at, I've posted on the Moodle, on our Moodle page, in the assignment instructions at the top, there is an informed consent form with the assignment instructions. And this is for, that I would like you to use for the semi-structured interview that you'll be doing. And then also to be including it with your proposal that you submit at the end of the term. And where the idea for informed consent came from was back in the 60s. There was, it was found at the Tuskegee Institute in the US. They were doing experiments on Black-bodied people. Medical experiments that were deeply harmful. And so a lot of this idea of informed consent and research came from the medical field. So while we look at this has become kind of a quote, okay, best practice, you need to have this informed consent, I do want to highlight that part of the problem now is that informed consent is often used as, okay, that's all we need to do. And what I would encourage is that the informed consent is the minimum you need to do. So that's the bare minimum. So when you're doing participatory research, that you're creating something like guidelines of principles, guidelines of ethics with the community, as I mentioned a minute ago. So just keeping in mind, if you get into research at all and people talk about, human subjects research and doing your informed consent, that again, that is the minimum that's happening. What other mechanisms are being put in place to make sure that you're having strong ethical approach in the process. Um, and so I will share my screen just for a moment here. So can you all see that okay? Awesome. Okay. So there's a Word document of this, like I said, in your assignment instructions in the Mahara page course site. And so what I've done in the Word document, I've highlighted, I've filled in some of the elements for you, but I've highlighted really what you need to be filling in here. And so I provided kind of some examples of language, which, you're welcome to keep and you're welcome to edit. So for example, confidentiality, I say example wording, so if you keep that wording, you just take out this part, or if you want to edit it all, so that in your final informed consent form, there shouldn't be any highlighting. There are things that say example of wording. You want to have the final version. So you're going to be putting in, your name up here. You're going to write in a couple sentence summary about your research topic. This is where you'll briefly summarize, what you're asking them to do. For example, that they might be responding to a series of questions, and the interview will take approximately 1 hour, for example. Okay, so that you're going to be writing that in. And then with the rest of these, I put in some example wording. So you'll be taking out these highlighted points, and then you can either, this is pretty generic language that I used for each of these. So you're certainly welcome to, and I encourage you to, if you want to tailor the wording at all in these sections. But I put these in as kind of, generic language that would often go in those kinds of sections. And then we get to the bottom, and this is where you'll put in your email address, and then where you will ask them to sign, or if anyone doesn't write, that you could ask them, permission orally, and then you can include that you received oral permission. Also keeping in mind, I obviously typed this in English, and so if it makes more sense for you to translate it in a different language, or again, if you want to have this in English and then you're speaking it orally in whatever language that person speaks, and then you're receiving consent orally, that you would just mark down that you received consent orally. And then also a place to initial if they're agreeing to being audio or video recorded, right? So you always want to get specific permission for that as well. That the informed consent alone isn't giving permission to record, that you want to be sure that you receive that. And then at the end, there's also a question if they want to be anonymous, or if they're giving permission to use their name and affiliation. And typically in research, if someone is in a leadership position, if they're in government, if they're, chief of their village, where it'd be really hard to hide their identity, that, if they're a public figure, that often their name would be used, right? Because anyone familiar with the situation would know who's being spoken about if they're kind of a public figure. Anyone who's not a public figure, the question is of whether you can do different things where they're use pseudonyms and they're anonymous. You can do a mixed approach if some people are named, some are pseudonyms. And this is where sometimes the researcher needs to step in a little more, in that if you're seeing a bigger picture in a way. This is one of the bigger dilemmas I've had in past work of, for example, working with communities, displaced um, from oil projects in West Africa, and they're young and activists, and very adamant about having their names put on some documents, and sometimes in telling them that I was doing it, um, I made it anonymous because sometimes when you're really in it, it's harder to see the bigger scope a little. And I could see some dangers that were coming their way, that they weren't, that they were thinking about a little differently, right? Because you're coming at it from a different purview. Um, and so there are times when, in conversation with the community, that you also do practice some agency as the researcher and provide your own insight and perspective as to when it's appropriate to be including someone's actual names, and seeing, okay, is there potential for harm here? Is there potential that for violence? Is there potential that they could be harmed in some way if their name is displayed on this or connected to this? And so those are the kinds of things that why it's important to be doing this, in relationship, in close communication with people, because those are some of the difficult conversations that can be required. And so saying that, um, before we go into the next step, are there any questions on the informed consent, or kind of in thinking about different kind of ethical practices and principles? Maher, yes.
Hello, everyone. So please, I have a question about like the consent. Maybe some people sometimes they need to see the questions before they sign it, or also some people they sign and then when we start the interview with them, they ask to stop or they ask to change something on the consent. So, what are like the best advices to avoid this kind of challenges?
So so that's a great question. In the informed consent, you're giving a summary. You're not necessarily writing every single question. You could certainly do that, just, kind of typical practice. You're giving a summary of it. But part of that consent also includes one that they are, even once they've signed that, if they want to stop at any time or not participate, even once they've started, that they have the ability to do so. So just because they've signed that form, they still have the permission to stop at any point in their participation. They can fully revoke their participation, or they can say, okay, I'm only going to respond to that part. You can record that, and I'm not going to respond to the other questions. That just because they've signed that consent, they still maintain that agency to do so. And in terms of if they want to change questions, this gets into a bit of the kind of idea too of the semi-structured interview that I'm asking you to be doing here, where, as we talked about last time, this is different than back and forth question and answer, where the questions are a bit more open-ended to allow for discussion together. And not having questions that are closed or leading, but rather that allow space for conversation. So, it can be helpful. You want to keep in mind some key points you want to be sure to touch on, but that you're not being closed off to other points emerging, because sometimes that can be the heart of the story and what's really important to focus on that you might not have come in with. And so relating back to your question, Maher, if they're asking about a change in a question, so if the wording of it, maybe from their perspective, there's, if the wording is inappropriate, or isn't clear to them, right? And they're saying, well, actually, is it this that you're intending? That's really important to listen to. Or if they're proposing, hey, actually, this is the question, like you asked me this question, but I'm going to respond to this question because this is actually what I think is an important point, that that semi-structured format is designed so that it's creating a space for their input as well in both the answers, but also the questions in having that conversation together. And I mean, where I've found anytime, I've gone in with, okay, I have my interview guide, right? I've never developed an interview guide that didn't get thrown out the window from the first conversation. Because especially as you're digging into this for a long time, you're working through this, it might be with a community you've worked with for a long time, so you might have a leg up in terms of having a better sense as to the questions that are important. Might be a community you're working with for the first time, or it might be your own community. And I would encourage in any of those cases, even if you've been engaged with that community for a long time, that things are always changing and shifting. There's some communities I've worked with for 12 plus years now that I need to learn from them what the important questions are in the moment, because things are always shifting. And what maybe was most relevant 3 or 4 years ago is not the most relevant question to be focusing on right now. And so that can be challenging too if it's communities you've worked with for a long time, because you feel like, okay, we're on that kind of pace together. I know what's unfolding, but it's still important that it's driven from them. And so if folks are suggesting either, oh, I'm not going to respond to that question, that's perfectly fine. They can skip that. Or if they're suggesting, actually, I'm going to respond to a question you haven't asked, or this is how I might word the question, that's really important to listen to as well, because that might be really shaping the results that you're finding. Did that answer what you were getting at?
Yes, thank you so much.
And I know there's been a couple of questions also separately about the second quiz for this week. For anyone who didn't get to that yet, it's still open. So please do complete it as soon as you can. There's just the 2 quizzes for this course, so that'll be the last one. And I think you'll find it hopefully doesn't take very long. So definitely, I know a couple of folks had messaged me as well. So if anyone hasn't gotten to that yet, please do so as soon as you can. Other questions for the consent process?
So I had just a query. So when we are like explaining our project or explaining our research to the participant, um, do you think if explaining too much about our research might affect their answers, or might affect their might influence their response to that question? Because in that way maybe they'll get an idea what we want to uh, get through the research. So
No, it's a great question. And that's where you have to think about, you don't want your overall research question or your interview questions. That's a good check on them as well, that you're not being too leading, in the sense that you're not already developing the answer in your question. And that can be a good check on it. Okay, if I'm going to share this question with someone, does it indicate that I already have the answer? Or that I think I have the answer? And if it does, then we need to think about, how do we reframe that question? There's other instances, say, for example, subcommittees I've worked in where, if I was really interested in, a lot of my work is on climate adaptation, and I was interested in perspectives and perceptions about climate change. Some communities that wouldn't go over well using that language of climate change. So I'd find other ways to talk about it, of increasing extreme weather events, weather variability, finding different words, but then kind of in the course of the conversation, you know, guiding it towards that direction of more about climate effects and climate variability as opposed to just weather. And so there can be considerations of that as well as to what really is even appropriate to talk about in certain contexts, but overall, it is a good kind of checkpoint for your questions. If you're asking a question and it seems like you have the answer already, then that's a good indication of, okay, I need to be framing the question in a different way. Yeah, great point. Thank you, Gunjan.
I would like to support maybe compliment Gunjan, and yeah, very often what during an open-ended question, what you do is actually when you ask a question to your respondent, you tend to actually ask a question. If you don't get the right answer to respond to your question, you tend to top up on your question until you get the right answer that you intend to get. So I think this can actually, you're just trying to guide the people to answer you rightly. So I think this happens most of the time.
And yeah, I appreciate that, Dorji. And that's why with more of the open-ended, that you have to think about it as kind of topics you want to reach on, and there's going to be follow-up questions. The only thing I would say is to caution from that it's not about getting them to a right answer. It's their answer. So and some of this too, we have to kind of let go what we think is going to be the answer, because otherwise we might miss what they're pointing at, which could be something totally new or totally different than we anticipated or expected. So it's good to go in with some expectations of, okay, I anticipate that I might get this kind of response, because that can help you think about follow-up questions you kind of want to have in your back pocket if certain things come up, but then be prepared for if it goes a really different direction. And especially being prepared for things that you don't anticipate, and allowing that to kind of be in the space as well. And so, having some questions for follow-up kind of in your back pocket that might get to, especially if things start going off. I think part of Dorji, your really good point was like, if it starts going off on a huge tangent, and you want to like kind of bring back to the topic, it's important sometimes to let that tangent go for a bit, because you might see that folks bring it back around, or they're actually making a connection that you haven't thought about. But sometimes things really can go in a totally other direction, and you're wanting to come back to the topic, that you have those questions in hand to kind of guide back to the topic that you're focusing on. And Melchiad, I think you had your hand up.
Okay. Trying to respect ethics in research, sometimes research become difficult to do. When the research is not aligned with the will of authority, the research becomes difficult. I would like to know if, in that case, we can do the research without respect the ethics, by omitting certain points, like to be openness.
So that's a great question. Do you have do you have an example in mind where that might not, where you would have to kind of not follow along with more of the ethical approach?
I don't understand.
Like, do you have an example you're thinking of in that context?
When I wanted to know how is the situation of a community, and to make no, I want to know the situation of the community, like how they live, how they are in the poor condition, and when the authority, the authorities don't want it, that to be this condition to be known, they can weaken the research.
Yeah, no, I seriously, so yeah, so absolutely. So in that context, you know, it's not that you're not taking an ethical approach, it's who's included and who the focus of that is. So that the ethical approach that you're adhering to is in the work with the community. That, so for example, that you're responsible for safeguarding that data, especially if there could be harm for if authority figures, if officials are finding out certain things and they don't want that information known. There's going to have to be tremendous safeguarding of the information, safeguarding to protect identities of the people. And so all of these points would hold true, but you have to think about you, but your primary responsibility is to the people with whom you're working with. And so it's a little different in that, okay, are you receiving, you know, what the official channel of being there and doing that work doesn't always necessarily come from that government official, but is there a certain channel to go through it in the community is a question. And there may not be, right? But there's also an informal networks and expectations. And so sometimes there's, you know, more informal community leaders, right? That, and kind of those, what sometimes folks call as kind of culture brokers that act as the liaison between if there's a journalist coming in, if there's a researcher, you know, someone doing reporting. That's not always the case, right? But also, so when we think about kind of these quote official channels, it's not always necessarily this government official. We also have to think about, you know, what are those formal and informal channels within the community itself. But that also the responsibility and the protection and the ethical approach is in the design of how you're doing that work with the community. And especially becomes important if there's risk to them in the context of responding to any questions, of being part of this. If, you know, if say authority figures were to find out, they don't want that information known and out there publicly. And so I would argue that it's almost not to say a more rigorous ethical approach, but it's very much there, especially in that safeguarding and protection. And a lot of this is also being open and transparent, and that's where the honesty comes in, that we can never fully mitigate the risks. And that's what's really important in the consent process, is here are steps that you're doing to mitigate the risk, but that risk is not gone. And that's why it has to be a consent process where it's very clearly understood and talked about as to what are those risks. And here is what that person is taking on by being part of this, and recognizing, you know, okay, as the researcher, here's what I'm doing to reduce that harm. Here's what I'm doing to mitigate the risks. So it might be a conversation about, here's how I'm going to protect your identity. Here's how I'm going to safeguard the information. But you can never eliminate risk entirely, especially in today's world. You know, it's like you send one thing out on an email and you have to be prepared that the whole world can know that information now, right? That as soon as anything goes out there, it's like, oh, Melchiad, I'm going to tell you a secret over email and don't tell anyone, right? Like, and it's nothing of your own doing, just somehow that can just get out there in the world, right? So we always have to be prepared that any information, any data being collected, how is that being secured? Because that can very quickly get out of your hands through many different channels. So also, even if just saying, oh, okay, it's on my computer, is that safe? Is that secure? Oh, I have it recorded on my phone. What happens if you lose your phone walking through the area that no one's supposed to know that information is being collected and someone picks that up, right? I mean, these things happen all the time. I mean, I'm saying that as not a personal story, but from a friend of mine, right? Like not intentional. He dropped his phone, and that's where he had the information, right? That is not unusual. And so that's where it becomes really critical as to how everything that we're doing to protect that information, but recognizing it is not 100%. And so that's where it becomes really important to be honest and open. And it's not about convincing anyone into being part of this. It's an open conversation where they have the choice to do so. And, as Maher brought up earlier, they have the choice to stop at any time. Or if someone, I've done this where, people have interviewed me for something and then I felt really uncomfortable about where they were going with it. And at the end I said, no, that cannot be used. So that's also needs to be understood as well. Someone could go through a whole interview, go through a whole focus group, and then they can decide afterwards, hey, I don't want you to use that information, it needs to be destroyed. So even if they've signed the forms, right, that they still hold that power to do so, that it's not just by signing on these things, they haven't given away that agency to not have the information included. Yeah, so these are really, really, really good questions to start going with. Yeah, and Austin shared, article a couple weeks ago about knowing when not to publish for the good of the community. This becomes really important. This came up in my dissertation defense for my doctorate, and that my committee was noticing some clear gaps in the research and saying, how did you not get this information? How's this not included? I said, well, no, I know it and I have it. I'm never going to share it. And in talking through why, it was understood why that could not come out in any sort of public document. And that becomes really important too, as to that's where also sharing the results and where it's going, because there are certain things that should never be shared. That sometimes it can be, and I mean, I've done projects with communities that nothing ever came of it publicly, but the point was for what they were doing internally, right? And this is where it can be tricky, and thinking too about where we talked about a few minutes ago of like, if you have a responsibility to a funder, right, that they might be asking for information. There might be certain information that's shared, that's agreed upon, but there might be a lot of other kind of information collected that's never shared. And so you can almost have, we call sometimes like I don't want to say like the dummy set of data. It's like the publicly facing data and information, and then you have the data that's meant for internal purposes for the community, and that happens all the time. So also recognizing, even if depending on, say, a funding source that you're required, say, to be sharing information, it doesn't mean that you have to share all information. And so this is where that open communication becomes really important as well. Yeah, thank you for raising that. And so, okay, what I'd like to do in the bit of time we have here, we're going to get into groups. Let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to get into mostly groups of 3, and just we'll have just like 3 or 4 minutes each to just talk through, your revised research question, and if you want to touch base on any of your interview questions. Also, I wanted to have this conversation today, and then I'll be, like I did with the research questions last week, I'll be responding in Mahara specifically to each of you, but kind of following that pattern of last week, I want to have this discussion first, because some of what I'll be saying is kind of prefaced here. And so I'm going to get you into the breakout groups, and then we'll come back here at about 5 minutes before the hour is up. Okay, let's see here. You want... Okay, join your group when you can. And yeah, so I know we're just about out of time, y'all. Just to, as I was sharing with Lidette, that like I said before the breakouts, I wanted to have this conversation today, and then I'll be replying like I did last week to in the Moodle page with any suggestions. And so if anyone hasn't posted your revised question and your draft interview questions, please do so in the next few hours, ideally. That would be great. And just to note, remember to be looking back at your assignment instructions that are at the top of the Moodle space, Moodle page, that clearly, or that depicts what I'm asking you to do for the interviews, for the semi-structured interview. So the idea is that in 2 weeks from now, on the May 6th course, you're going to be bringing in a segment of your interview that we're going to work on coding. We're going to practice kind of quoting and qualitative analysis of a research interview in class. And so that means you have from now until the 5th of May to do the interview. So you have about 2 weeks. So please make sure you're working on that. And then next week, we are going to be focusing on kind of the transformative power of storytelling. And we'll have Dr. Mary Hufford with us, who's a colleague of mine at the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network. And so there's a forum on Moodle site for this coming week. I'm asking you to post a question for Dr. Hufford by Monday night university time, so that way I can share them with her and she can be prepared ahead of our class on Thursday. Okay, so if there's any questions or anything coming up, please don't hesitate to reach out. And like I said, I'll be responding to kind of providing any follow-up to your draft interview questions. And just be sure to be working on that in the next couple of weeks, and then we will go from there. All right, so it was good to see everybody, and I will see you next week.